What if I told you that the most spectacular feasts in history were held without a single metal pot, pan, or cauldron? We are used to imagining Vikings with huge copper cauldrons over a fire, but the truth is that metal was too expensive and rare in the north to be used for kitchen utensils for hundreds of guests. These people had technologies that allowed them to feed an entire army using only wood, stones, earth, and water. They turned the very ground beneath their feet into a giant steamer and ordinary cobblestones into powerful heating elements. In their hands, the elements of fire and stone combined to create culinary masterpieces whose taste we cannot even imagine today. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the Northerners managed to boil hundreds of liters of water in wooden troughs without burning them, and what forgotten method allowed meat to melt in the mouth after a day underground.
The earth has blessed this meat.
Aye, it is the best yet.
Heave, men! Watch the barrels! Steady, steady. Bring the spears down next.
Want to know a secret that will change your perception of ancient cooking? In the Viking Age, metal was a strategic resource used to forge swords, axes, and spearheads, but not for everyday cooking utensils. Iron was so highly valued that every scrap of it could decide the outcome of a battle or strengthen a leader's power. Therefore, even a simple metal ladle was a rarity, and large cauldrons were considered a luxury. A huge iron cauldron was a symbol of incredible wealth, available only to konungs, and its very presence emphasized the power of its owner. Ordinary communities lived much more modestly and relied on completely different methods of cooking. People had to find ways to process food that did not require fireproof cookware capable of withstanding direct contact with flames, and this forced them to show remarkable ingenuity. This limitation gave rise to a unique stone kitchen culture, where the main tool was not a knife or a ladle, but a properly selected cobblestone capable of retaining heat. Northerners were well versed in geology, although they did not know the word itself, of course. For years, they observed the behavior of stone, tested its strength, and gradually learned to distinguish between rocks by their structure and density. They looked for stones of volcanic origin that could withstand repeated cycles of heating and cooling while retaining their shape. People knew that ordinary river stones could explode when they hit the water, turning into deadly shrapnel, and therefore took the choice very seriously. The selection of kitchen stones was a matter of life and death, and mistakes were not allowed. Experienced craftsmen found basalt or dense granite, which accumulated heat better than modern cast iron, and these stones were valued almost as much as a good tool. They were cherished, passed down from generation to generation, and used for years until they lost their strength and crumbled into sand from hundreds of meals cooked. Preparation for the cooking process began long before the food was put in water or on the fire. In the center of the longhouse where the whole family lived, a huge fire was lit, around which many residents gathered and worked. Dozens of specially selected stones were laid at the base of the fire, distributing them so that everyone would get as much heat as possible. The fire had to burn for several hours, and people watched over it, adding wood and adjusting the intensity of the flames. This required attention and skill, because a fire that was too weak would not heat the stones, and one that was too strong could damage the house. Such a fire consumed a huge amount of wood, which was gathered by all the free men of the settlement, so they always tried to use the fuel wisely. When the stones reached the right temperature, the most dangerous stage began. They were removed from the fire with special tongs made of deer antlers or raw, undried wood, which did not ignite instantly. The work was hard, requiring precision and coordination, especially in the confined space of a longhouse. One wrong move could result in severe burns, or a fire that would destroy both the house and the supplies. People approached this stage with the utmost caution, as the hot stone carried a tremendous amount of energy. It could instantly boil water, char meat, or burn a wooden bowl if placed incorrectly. The use of such stones gave northerners enormous advantages in conditions where metal was rare and expensive. It was this technology that allowed the Vikings to be independent of massive utensils, which were difficult to transport and required constant care. They could cook food in almost any conditions, whether it was a camp on the shore of a foreign sea or wintering in their native fjord, where the wind chilled them to the bone. To provide themselves with hot food, warriors and travelers only needed to find suitable stones and enough firewood. Nature provided them with everything they needed, making them mobile and resilient. Such cooking methods not only compensated for the lack of metal utensils, but also formed a special food culture. Hot soups, thick stews, and rich fish broths were easily prepared on hot stones and allowed people to warm their bodies in the harsh climate. Even in the poorest communities, people could afford hot food that was not only tasty, but also healthy. This method of cooking did not require complex equipment, but it did require skill in working with heat, observation, and patience. Therefore, knowledge of stone cooking was passed down from generation to generation, along with the secrets of choosing stones and how long to heat them. As the Vikings explored new lands, their experience of cooking on stones spread further. A hand-heated stone could be placed in a wooden tub filled with water to quickly cook fish or meat. This method was considered convenient on expeditions where there was no time to build a long burning fire. Travelers prepared several stones in advance, stored them in the boat, and used them at the first opportunity. Thanks to this, the northerners could eat hot food even during long journeys when the weather was harsh and their strength was quickly fading. Thus, the lack of metal was not a sign of poverty or backwardness, but became an incentive for the development of amazing engineering ideas. The Vikings learned to use the heat capacity of stone with an efficiency that modern physicists would envy, and they did so without scientific instruments, relying solely on observation and practice. Their kitchen was a kind of laboratory for managing thermal energy, where every step was important. Each stage, from gathering raw materials to preparing a dish, required thoughtfulness and precision, and this is what made the stone kitchen so remarkable. People turned natural materials into tools that allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions, and they did so with remarkable precision. We would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think modern chefs could prepare a meal using only hot stones and wooden utensils? Let us know in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how to boil water in a wooden barrel? It seems impossible to cook soup in a wooden trough or leather bag because wood will burn and leather will burn through over an open fire. But the Vikings circumvented this law of physics with elegance, using a method of immersion heating. Instead of placing the container on the fire, they placed the fire inside the container using those very hot stones. Cold water prepared for cooking meat or fish was poured into large wooden vats or hollowed-out logs. Then the cooks began to lower white-hot stones, taken directly from the fire, into the water one by one. The water around the stone instantly boiled, transferring heat to the entire volume of liquid and creating a bubbling stream. The art was to maintain a constant boiling temperature by rhythmically adding new stones and removing cooled ones. It was a continuous conveyor belt, where some people watched the fire, others carried stones, and still others controlled the cooking process. If too many stones were added at once, the water could spill out, and if there was a delay, the boiling would stop. The water in such containers was not simply heated, it was saturated with minerals and the light aroma of smoke from the ash-covered stones. This specific flavor was an integral part of any meal, whether it was a meat stew or fish soup. The food acquired a unique flavor that cannot be reproduced on a modern stove. The cooled stones were removed with special scoops or pitchforks, taking care not to damage the wooden walls of the vessel. Ash and stone chips accumulated at the bottom of the container, so the broth always had to be handled with care when pouring. However, it was this method that made it possible to cook huge amounts of food for the entire drugina at once. This method was universal. On campaigns, instead of wooden troughs, they used pits in the ground lined with animal skins. The skin, filled with water, held its shape perfectly, and the stones provided the necessary heat. This allowed the Vikings to organize hot meals in the open field without having any dishes with them. Over time, the inside of the wooden containers became charred from contact with the stones, creating an additional protective layer. These logs served for years, becoming saturated with fat and even more waterproof. It was a simple but incredibly reliable system that worked flawlessly. Large-scale feasts required the use of dozens of such containers at the same time, turning the kitchen into a smoky and noisy workshop. Steam rose to the ceiling of the longhouse, mixing with the smoke from the hearth and creating a dense, fragrant atmosphere. The most surprising thing was that this method allowed for even more precise temperature control than on an open fire. An experienced cook knew how many stones were needed for simmering and how many for vigorous boiling. But cooking was only part of the Northerners' culinary arsenal. In the next chapter, you will learn how they built giant ovens right in the ground to bake whole carcasses.
Soon, my friend. There will be enough for everyone.
I brought the ale.
What I am about to show you should not be attempted without preparation, as it is a real engineering feat. The pinnacle of Viking culinary skill was cooking meat in a cider, a special earthen pit that functioned both as a pressure cooker and a slow oven. This method was not widely known and was only used in special cases when it was necessary to cook large carcasses that were difficult to process using conventional methods. Whole sheep, pigs, and even large deer were cooked in such pits to feed a large number of people. This type of cooking was not considered ordinary cooking, but rather an important ritual in which the entire settlement participated. People gathered firewood in advance, prepared the site, and created an atmosphere of anticipation, because the result was part of the celebration and a symbol of unity. First, a deep rectangular pit had to be dug, the size of which depended on how much meat was to be cooked. The larger the carcass, the deeper and wider the pit was made so that the heat would be distributed evenly. The bottom and walls of the pit were lined with flat stones to create a strong and stable structure that could withstand intense heat. These stone walls made the pit resemble a primitive oven, protected from collapse. After that, a huge fire was lit inside and kept burning for several hours until the stones reached their maximum temperature. The flames had to be strong enough to heat the entire thickness of the stonework. When the wood burned out and left behind a thick layer of coals, the pit was cleared of excess ash, leaving only the hot stone base. At this stage, it was important to work quickly so that the temperature did not have time to drop. The meat was prepared in advance by wrapping it in large leaves, damp cloths, or fresh straw. These materials created a protective layer that kept the food clean and retained moisture. Sometimes, carefully treated skins were used for this purpose, which became a natural shell that retained juices and aroma. This method of packaging not only protected the meat, but also made the taste richer. Wrapped pieces or whole carcasses were placed on hot stones, trying to arrange them as tightly and compactly as possible. This allowed the heat to be retained and ensured even cooking. After that, the entire structure was covered with peat, turf, or earth, creating an almost airtight chamber. Air stopped flowing inside, and the heat trapped underground remained stable for a long time. The meat began to simmer rather than fry, which allowed it to retain its tenderness and natural flavor. This created a real natural steam boiler that worked without metal or fire. In such an earth oven, the meat became unusually tender, even if the carcass was old or tough. Prolonged simmering broke down the fibers, and even large game became tender. This method produced results that were impossible to achieve over an open fire, where food quickly dries out. Inside the seed, the meat was saturated with the juices and aromas of the leaves or herbs with which it was wrapped. The taste became complex and deep, and such dishes were especially appreciated during major holidays. Often, it was the meat from the seed that became the central treat, which was then told about to guests from other villages. The cooking process could last from 10 hours to a day, depending on the size of the carcass and the thickness of the earthen layer. All this time, only experienced masters who understood how the temperature changed could watch over the oven. The tightness of the structure was checked for the absence of smoke. If the oven was built correctly, there was not the slightest sign of burning on the surface. People calmly walked over the pit, feeling the slight warmth coming from the ground, and knew that a slow cooking process was taking place beneath them. This anticipation only heightened their interest and made the feast even more eagerly awaited. The opening of the Seaid was the culmination of the holiday, which brought together all the inhabitants of the settlement. When the layer of turf or earth was removed, a thick column of fragrant steam burst out. This moment symbolized the completion of the work and the beginning of the feast. The smell of baked meat mixed with the aromas of herbs and a light, smoky note spreading throughout the area. People enjoyed not only the taste, but also the process itself, because they worked together to prepare this dish. It was a real triumph for the masters who managed to tame fire and earth, making them work for the benefit of the entire community. The taste of meat cooked in this way was rich and tender, and many described it as a special treat worthy of the most significant events. The meat retained its natural moisture and did not become dry even after many hours of slow cooking. Earthy and smoky notes gave it a unique aroma that could not be reproduced by other methods. Such dishes were even mentioned in sagas, where authors emphasized the luxury and generosity of feasts at which seder was used. These references are evidence of how highly this method of cooking was valued. It is noteworthy that seder made it possible to feed a large number of people using a relatively small amount of fuel. Once the meat was placed inside, the earth oven worked completely autonomously. This freed people from the need to constantly stay by the fire, and they could do other things or hold competitions. This method was ideal for large celebrations where hundreds of guests needed to be fed without distracting from other important events. The seder became not only a culinary device, but also part of the culture of the holiday itself. Have you ever tried meat cooked in the ground? Like this post if you would like to experience this ancient flavor. Guess how long it took to create the perfect grilling system without grates. In addition to cooking and baking in the ground, the Vikings were masters of the art of grilling over an open fire, but they did it with a special approach. They did not use metal grates or skewers, replacing them with structures made of fresh, raw wood that did not burn, but only charred. Wooden skewers made of hazel or willow were disposable, hygienic, and added extra flavor to the meat. The key point was the choice of wood for the fire itself, as smoke was the main seasoning. The Vikings never used resinous species such as pine or spruce, which gave a bitter taste and black soot. For the perfect heat, they chose oak, beech, or ash, which burned evenly and for a long time. Meat was often roasted not over the fire, but next to it, using the heat radiation from the coals. The carcasses were stretched on wooden frames or hung on tripods around the fire pit. This allowed the fat to drip into special trays or onto bread, rather than into the fire, preventing flare-ups and burning. Cooks constantly basted the meat with fat or salt water, using bundles of herbs instead of brushes. Juniper was a favorite spice, and its branches were sometimes thrown directly into the coals at the end of cooking to create aromatic smoke. This smoke also served as a preservative, allowing the roasted meat to stay fresh longer. Special attention was paid to frying fish, which was often cooked on flat boards set at an angle to the fire. The fish was nailed to the board with wooden pegs and slowly baked in the heat of the fire. The fat dripped down, and the fish was infused with the smell of smoke and heated wood. This method required constant attention and adjustment of the distance to the heat source. The cook had to feel the heat with his skin, understanding when to move the meat away and when to bring it closer. It was an intuitive skill passed down from father to son. The vertical arrangement of the food allowed several dishes to be cooked around one fire at once, saving firewood. A pot of water could hang in the center, and pieces of meat and fish could be roasted around it. The hearth became a universal station, working 360 degrees. In the conditions of polar night or strong winds, this method was the most reliable way to obtain high-calorie food. The heat from the fire warmed the cooks, and the smell of roasted meat raised the morale of the team. But meat was not the only thing that required a special approach to fire. In the next chapter, you will learn how Northerners preserved food for months without refrigerators. No feast could take place without supplies prepared months in advance. In a world without electricity and refrigeration, the ability to preserve food was more important than the ability to cook it. The Vikings were masters of preservation, turning perishable foods into resources that could survive long winters and sea voyages. Drying was the most common and accessible method, especially for fish in northern latitudes. Cod was hung on huge wooden frames in the wind, where the cold air drew all the moisture out of it. Such fish became as hard as wood, could be stored for years, and required long soaking and hammering before consumption. Smoking took place in special smokehouses or simply under the roof of a long house, where smoke from the hearth accumulated naturally. The meat, hung from the ceiling, slowly absorbed the smoky phenols, which killed bacteria and repelled insects. This product acquired a dark color and rich flavor that we associate today with traditional cuisine. Salting was an expensive pleasure, as salt had to be obtained by evaporating seawater or purchased. Therefore, brining or dry salting was more often used only for the most valuable parts of the carcass. Salted meat was considered a delicacy and a sign of the wealth of the owner of the house. Another unique method was pickling or fermentation, similar to the preparation of surströmming or hackal. The products were placed in barrels or pits, where they underwent controlled fermentation under the influence of lactic acid. This changed the structure and smell of the food, but made it safe for long-term storage and easy to digest. Dairy products were processed into butter and cheese, as well as a special product called skyer. Whey was used as a preservative for storing meat, as the acidic environment prevented decay. Barrels of meat in whey could be stored in pantries throughout the winter, providing the family with protein. Grain was stored in special barns on stilts, protecting it from rodents and dampness. Before use, it was often roasted on stones to kill pests and improve the taste. Coarsely ground flour was the staple of the diet, but it required constant protection from mold. Vegetables such as turnips, cabbage, and onions were stored in cool earthen cellars or dried. They were added to soups in winter, rehydrated in hot water. Berries and fruits were dried or covered with honey, which served as an excellent natural preservative. These reserves formed the basis of any feast, allowing a rich table to be set even in the depths of winter. A host whose storerooms were full of dried meat and fish was held in high esteem. The ability to preserve what had been obtained was valued no less than luck in hunting or raiding. What if I showed you a time machine that could transport you back 1,000 years to experience the taste of bread? Bread in the Viking era was strikingly different from the fluffy loaves we are used to today. In those days, yeast was rarely used, and the familiar airy dough simply did not exist. The Northerners baked flat, dense cakes that resembled a thick mixture of grain and water more than soft bread. They were made from barley or oat flour because wheat did not grow well in the harsh climate. This bread was filling, coarse, and retained the taste of earth and smoke. The lack of sophisticated ovens made their cuisine simple and down to earth. Most families had only an open hearth, where the fire was used both for cooking and for heating the home. The flour was ground by hand using stone millstones, and this coarse grinding gave the bread a nutty flavor. Flatbread was part of the daily life of every northerner, as it could be prepared quickly and without unnecessary expense. It was bread that reflected the harsh character of the people who created it. The dough was kneaded in large wooden vats, which were often passed down from generation to generation. Water, whey, or sometimes blood was poured into them if the bread needed to be particularly filling. Only a little salt was added, and only when it was available, as it was considered a valuable commodity. Leaven from the previous batch was used as a raising agent, but more often than not, the dough was simply warmed up a little by the fire. Kneading required strength, as the flour was heavy and absorbed a lot of liquid. This work almost always fell to women, and they did it every day. Kneading took a long time because it was necessary to achieve a dense and homogeneous mass. The housewife had to feel the dough with her hands to determine the right amount of water and density. The Vikings trusted this process no less than they trusted the preparation of weapons for a campaign. The ability to knead dough correctly was considered part of domestic craftsmanship. Bread was baked on flat stones that were placed directly in the hearth. The stone had to be heated for a long time so that the heat was distributed evenly, otherwise the dough would burn quickly. Sometimes a family could afford an iron skillet with a long handle, which made cooking easier. But such items were expensive and therefore rare. Thin flatbreads were the most reliable option, as thick dough simply did not have time to bake through. Before baking, the hostess carefully cleaned the stone to remove soot and ash. The dough was stretched by hand into a round, flat shape, trying to make it the same thickness. The stone gave off heat quickly, so the flatbread was covered with a hard crust almost immediately after it hit the surface. It was a process that required attention and dexterity. Even a small mistake could ruin the entire batch. Sometimes bread was baked directly in hot ashes, with the coals pushed aside. This method was available to almost every family because it did not require any additional utensils. The thick crust protected the crumb from the ashes and was easily removed with a knife after baking. The bread acquired the smell of a fire mixed with the aroma of grain. People appreciated this taste because it reminded them of home and their working days. The smell of smoky bread accompanied them on their travels and in their daily lives. When the coals cooled down, the flatbreads were ready and were set aside for the next meal. Even a small portion of soup or a thin slice of fish could accompany such bread because it was very filling. The aroma of the ash crust was as familiar to northerners as the smell of a fresh bakery is to us. It was part of their world, their cuisine, and their history. Crushed nuts, dried berries, or legumes were often added to the dough to make it more nutritious. Such additives made the bread more varied in taste, which was important during the cold season. Sometimes crushed tree bark was added if the harvests were poor. In particularly difficult years, moss or finely ground pine needles were mixed into the flour to preserve at least a small amount of food. For them, bread was not just a product, but a guarantee of survival. Every housewife strove to make her bread tastier than her neighbors by using different combinations of available additives. Due to the constant shortage of food, they had to be inventive. Simple recipes could vary depending on what was available. This demonstrated the ability of northerners to adapt to nature. Bread became a reflection of their perseverance and resilience. The finished flatbreads were stacked and stored for weeks. Over time, they became hard, turning into crackers. Such crackers were convenient for travel, especially on sea voyages, where there was nowhere to get fresh food. Before eating, they were soaked in broth, oil, or beer. This allowed them to regain their softness and made their taste more intense. Crackers were real fuel for rowers who spent hours at the oars. They could be stored for months without spoiling, which made them indispensable. The Vikings took them on long voyages, where every crumb of food mattered. Rusks provided energy and strength, helping them endure the rigors of long journeys. It was food tested by wind, sea, and time. Fresh, hot bread was served at feasts as a base for meat dishes. It absorbed fat, juices, and the aroma of spices, becoming the most delicious treat by the end of the meal. Such bread was often used instead of plates and eaten along with the other dishes. This allowed for no waste and saved on tableware, which was a valuable item in every home. Bread served as both food and part of the table ritual. On big holidays, flatbreads could be prepared in large batches. They were laid out on long wooden tables so that guests could take them directly from the surface. The banquet table was filled with the aromas of roasted meat, honey, and fresh pastries. Bread became part of the tradition of hospitality, emphasizing the generosity of the hosts. Each meal became a sign of respect for those gathered. The quality of the bread spoke to the skill of the hostess, no less than the quality of a sword spoke to the skill of the blacksmith. The ability to bake a delicious flatbread on a simple stone required experience, patience, and knowledge of one's craft. Women passed this knowledge on to their daughters, preserving family traditions. Bread united generations and connected people to their land. It was part of a culture based on hard work and respect for nature. A housewife who baked good bread was respected in her home and among her neighbors. Her work was considered as important as that of a man working in a smithy. In a family where delicious flatbread was baked, people felt richer and more confident. Bread was a measure of wealth and the ability to manage a household, and it remained a symbol of warmth, comfort, and domestic strength. Bread was always served with drinks because dry food was not popular. In the next chapter, you will learn what the Vikings drank from their famous horns. Drinks at Viking feasts had a sacred meaning, often surpassing the importance of the food itself. Beer, ale, and mead were not just alcohol, but a way to cement alliances, celebrate victories, or honor the gods. These drinks were brewed in huge wooden vats using the same methods of heating with stones. The basis for ale was malt from barley or oats, which was germinated and dried. The process of brewing wort was long and laborious, requiring constant temperature control. Stones were thrown into the wort carefully so as not to burn the sugar and spoil the taste of the future drink. Hops were not yet widespread at that time, so a mixture of herbs called gruit was used for bitterness and aroma. Waxwort, yarrow, juniper, and bog rosemary were used. Each housewife kept her own secret recipe for the herbal mixture, which determined the unique taste of her homemade ale. Mead was considered a drink of the nobility and the gods, as honey was an expensive and rare resource in the north. It was made by fermenting diluted honey with water, sometimes with the addition of berries or spices. Aged mead was strong and sweet, and was drunk from small cups on special occasions. Fermentation took place in open vats under the influence of wild yeast that lived in the air and on the wooden walls of the vessels. Sometimes a magic wand was used, a wooden stirrer on which yeast cultures from previous brews were preserved. This guaranteed the start of the fermentation process. The finished drinks were stored in oak barrels, where they could mature and gain strength. Good beer was thick, nutritious, and served as a source of calories and vitamins in winter. It was often served warm, especially on cold evenings. The drinking ritual was strictly regulated. The cup was passed around, and everyone had to take a sip and make a toast. Refusal to drink could be taken as an insult to the host or disrespect to those gathered. Drunkenness was frowned upon in everyday life, but at feasts it was considered a way to achieve unity with the gods and companions. However, wise people knew their limits, as the skalds often warned in their poems. The ability to brew good beer was as important a skill for a woman as weaving or sewing. Without a decent drink, any feast would be considered a failure, and the host would be considered stingy. The culture of drinking also required special tableware that reflected the status of the feaster. Horns, cups, and bowls were decorations for the table and the pride of their owner. The ability to brew good beer was as important a skill for a woman as weaving or sewing. Without a decent drink, any feast would be considered a failure, and the host would be considered stingy. The culture of drinking also required special tableware that reflected the status of the feaster. Horns, cups, and bowls were decorations for the table and the pride of their owner. Dairy products were central to the Scandinavian diet, being the main source of fat and protein besides meat. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk, which was processed immediately, as it was impossible to keep it fresh. The Vikings perfected milk processing techniques. The main fermented milk product was skyr, something between thick yogurt and soft cottage cheese. It was prepared using a special starter culture passed down from generation to generation. Skyr was so thick that it could be cut with a knife and taken on the road, wrapped in cloth. Butter was incredibly valuable and served as a measure of wealth. People even paid taxes with it. Butter was churned in tall, narrow wooden churns and then heavily salted for long-term storage. Salted butter could be stored in barrels for months without losing its nutritional properties. The whey left over after making skyr and cheese was used everywhere. It was drunk as a refreshing beverage used to marinate meat and preserve food. It was a waste-free technology where every drop of milk was put to good use. Cheeses were made both soft and hard, pressed under heavy stones. Hard cheese was an excellent camping product, not freezing in the cold and not spoiling in the heat. Its taste was sharp and rich, completely unlike modern store-bought cheeses. At feasts, dairy products were served in large wooden bowls, often with the addition of honey or berries. Thick cream and sour cream were a sign of luxury, available to high-ranking guests. It was food that gave strength and warmth.
Help yourselves. It looks absolutely wonderful. Thank you. The berries are so fresh.
Cattle breeding in the north was hard work. The animals had to be fed throughout the long winter, keeping them in the barn. Therefore, the spring release of cattle to pastures and the appearance of fresh milk were a real celebration, celebrated by the entire community. White wealth, milk, and its derivatives allowed the Vikings to survive where agriculture was risky. The cow was treated almost as sacred, as it was the family's breadwinner. Table setting in the Viking era was far from the sophistication of Versailles receptions, but it had its own strict logic and aesthetics. Instead of refined gestures and porcelain, practicality and a clear order developed over generations reigned supreme. Long tables were knocked together from planks and set up on trestles just before the meal began, as there was no need to keep them up all the time. This solution allowed space to be quickly freed up if other work needed to be done. The living space of a longhouse could be turned into a banquet hall at any moment, making Viking feasts convenient and flexible. Such temporary tables were part of the everyday life of northerners who lived in places where every square meter of space had to be put to good use. A house rarely served only as a home, as it could also be used to shelter animals from bad weather, store supplies, or engage in crafts. Therefore, furniture was designed to be mobile and easy to disassemble. On holidays, the huge hall was filled with people and noise, and on ordinary days it was turned into a workspace. Such versatility reflected a lifestyle based on constant movement and readiness for change. Instead of individual plates, they used trenchers, large slices of stale bread, or flat wooden boards. This bread was specially prepared to be hard and durable, almost like edible tableware. Meat and side dishes were placed on the trenchers, allowing the bread to absorb all the juices. By the end of the meal, it became incredibly tasty and nutritious. Sometimes the guests ate it themselves, and sometimes they gave it to the dogs so that nothing would go to waste. This approach saved time, energy, and resources, which was especially important for people living in harsh climates. Washing large quantities of dishes was hard work, especially in winter when the water froze quickly. Therefore, trencher plates became a familiar part of the table, combining convenience and utility. They simplified the process of serving food and made feasts less troublesome. All this became part of the practical outlook on life characteristic of northern peoples. The main tool of the eater was his personal knife, which everyone carried on their belt. It was an item that accompanied a person everywhere and was often his only universal tool. There were no forks, so people ate with their hands and a knife, using a spoon to help with liquid dishes. The knife was sharp and durable, often decorated with carvings or metal details. It served as a weapon, a piece of cutlery, and a symbol of the owner's personal status. Such a knife was passed down from generation to generation and became a family heirloom. At feasts, it was used with great care to show good manners and respect for others. It was believed that a person who did not know how to use a knife properly at the table showed weakness of character and an inability to behave among others. Therefore, the ability to eat with a knife was an important skill in Viking society. It combined everyday necessity and cultural symbolism. Spoons were carved from wood or horn, making them deep and convenient for eating thick soups. Spoon making was a separate craft, and skilled craftsmen were highly valued. A beautiful carved spoon could be a valuable gift and passed down in the family as a sign of respect. Silver spoons could be found among the nobility, but such items were considered a luxury. Most people used wooden spoons, which lasted a long time and were pleasant to the touch. Each spoon reflected the craftsman's skill in working with the material and paying attention to small details. Horn and wood allowed for the creation of comfortable shapes that did not burn the hands when eating hot food. Northerners valued such items for their lightness and durability, as they could be used daily. A good spoon could accompany its owner on trips and serve him faithfully for a long time. The simplicity of these items emphasized the practicality of their culture. Drinking horns did not have legs, so they could not be placed on the table without being emptied. This rule inadvertently created a special rhythm for the feast. Guests had to either drink the horn dry or hold it in their hands until the next sip. This custom enlivened feasts and made people interact with each other more often. Only cups and bowls could be placed in front of oneself, but they were less common and were considered a sign of wealth. Horns were made from large bulls and decorated with metal or carvings, if the host could afford it. They symbolized strength and generosity, because only those who had wealth could fill a large horn. Drinking it to the bottom was considered an honor and a sign of respect for the host. Thanks to this, feasts turned into lively celebrations where drinks flowed freely. Such rituals were part of the cultural identity of Northerners. The seating arrangement of guests at the table was of great political significance. The most honorable places were in the center, next to the host and his high seat. The closer a guest was to the host, the higher his status in society. Those who sat further away occupied a lower position, and this was clear to everyone present. This system clearly demonstrated the hierarchy and helped to avoid disputes over seating. However, sometimes the seating arrangement caused discontent or hidden rivalry. Guests could perceive their place as a sign of respect or insult, depending on the circumstances. Therefore, the host had to make a wise decision, taking into account old alliances and grudges. A mistake could lead to long-lasting enmity, because honor was paramount. Thus, the simple allocation of seats became an important political act. Food was served on large communal dishes carved from wood or directly in cauldrons. These dishes were placed in the center of the table so that everyone could take a portion. Servers made sure that the most important guests got the best pieces, as this was considered a sign of respect. Resentment at a feast over a poor piece of meat could escalate into serious conflict. Therefore, it was important for the host to be generous and fair. Cleaning up after the feast was no less laborious than preparing it. Mountains of bones, food scraps, and ashes had to be cleaned up immediately to prevent rats and unpleasant odors. In cramped communal living conditions, hygiene was a matter of survival. Animal bones were not simply discarded. Large ones were split open to extract the nutritious marrow, which was considered a delicacy. The remains were used to make needles, combs, knife handles, and game pieces. Even garbage was a resource in the Viking Age. Ash from hearths was collected for use as lye for washing clothes and dishes. It was a universal cleaning agent, available in unlimited quantities. Greasy wooden dishes were cleaned with sand and grass, then rinsed with boiling water. Leftover food was carefully sorted and stored. Meat could be processed into sausages or dried. The thriftiness of the hostess was evident in how much food she managed to save after a lavish feast. The fire in the central hearth was never completely extinguished, but only smothered for the night by covering the coals with ashes. In the morning, it was rekindled, symbolizing the continuity of life in the home. Losing the fire was considered a bad omen. The ability to organize such a large-scale event without modern conveniences commands respect. It required precise logistics, distribution of roles, and a deep knowledge of the properties of natural materials. Each member of the community knew their place and their task. These cooking techniques, born in the harsh conditions of the North, have proven their effectiveness over centuries. They taught people patience, observation, and respect for resources. Today, we can only attempt to reconstruct that taste and atmosphere using archaeological finds and descriptions in sagas. But the spirit of those feasts where fire and stone fed heroes lives on in our historical memory. The legacy of the Vikings is not only their conquests, but also their ability to live in harmony with the harsh nature, turning its limitations into their advantages. We have seen that Viking cuisine was a true celebration of ingenuity over scarcity. The lack of metal did not stop them, but forced them to create unique technologies for cooking with stones and baking in the ground, which are still effective today. These people knew how to get the most out of wood, fire, and water, creating feasts worthy of legends. Their methods teach us that you don't always need complex tools to create something grand. All you need is ingenuity and knowledge of nature. The history of Northern cuisine is a story of survival that has become an art form. Which of the ancient techniques did you find most surprising? Cooking with stones in a wooden trough, or baking in an earth oven? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new dives into history.